All right. So welcome everybody to our online. Now I've lost the WebEx.
No, we can hear you well, Nico. This is Larissa. Yes, good. I can see you. We haven't lost you. And yes, the recording could start eventually. If
yeah, it does. It has already. Okay, so welcome everybody in the virtual room that we're now sharing in our Paths panel, kind of the first online Paths panel this semester, sort of in the context of our broader inquiry project on change in international law. We're very happy today to have particularly good kind of link between lawyers, of whom are quite a few in the room, and international relations theorists and others to discuss this. And that's precisely kind of what our group is really about, kind of trying to bring these two things together and trying to get lawyers and international relations scholars to talk to one another. So today is a particularly nice example, and especially nice because we have Antje Wiener with us, who will speak to us from Hamburg. I think, although kind of the location from which we speak is increasingly irrelevant and liquefied, you can say, in the in our virtual context. So Antje holds the chair of political science, especially global governance at the University of Hamburg, but she has a long and varied career. She's also a bi-fellow of Hall at Cambridge, fellow of the UK's Academy of Social Sciences. She has had chairs at Queen's University Belfast, the University of Bath, and she's published in enormous amount. Many of you will know quite a lot of her work, so I'm not going to introduce it in detail because it would take a long while that we better use for discussion and presentation, really. Just to highlight that her 2018 book, Contestation and Constitution of Norms in Global International Relations, that came out with Cambridge University Press, has made it on so many sort of award lists, has also gotten the ISA International Law Book Award in 2020, and maybe even more remarkably, I have to say, was on the International Affairs Top 10 Christmas readings. And I have to say, kind of when an academic book gets onto Christmas readings, you have to achieve something, certainly in terms of readability. And I have to say, I really found the book enormously engaging and illuminating. So I can very much see why all those accolades. And I'm very happy that you can be with us today, Antje, and share your ongoing work on norms and contestation. We're also really happy to have our own Anna Burai as a commentator. Anna is a postdoc at the Graduate Institute in the project on to save and to defend global normative ambiguity and regional order, where she's working on African regional and sub-regional organizations. She is graduated from Central European University, and now we're happy that she has made the move to Geneva and is engaging. As she said before, she's a longtime fan of Antje's work. Now, of course, kind of that might not get us the real tension and conflict and contestation that we want, but we hope that you have enough things to remark upon on Antje's paper. All right, now, I'm not going to say more, really, kind of welcome to Antje and Anna and everybody else, and I give the floor to Antje, who will also kick us off with a technology gadget, as she's promised, so we'll try.
Yes. Well, I thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm going to share my screen in a moment. Let me just say that I didn't really publish as much as the distinguished other members of the panel, but maybe I chose sometimes the right moment. And when they said the Christmas book list, I think I made it onto the list because the book is not for hot takes. So that's basically what the main characteristic was. So let's start sharing here. And I'll start with
No.
No.
Antje, I certainly can't hear you now.
I think you need to unmute.
Yeah, I think you need to unmute or no, still. No. Wait.
Can you now say something? No. Try to unmute you. Can you say something, Antje, now?
Okay, let me just see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So this is my gadgetry. That's at least the song worked. So now we go ahead. So I'll be talking about normative change in international relations. I'll be presenting a conceptual framework. Well, I've been sort of encouraged by lawyers and political scientists alike who started using or referring to this framework, and I was asked by the college research group on the rule of law in Berlin to kind of summarize this framework. So I've done that, and I wanted to share that with you today. I'm still a political scientist, and I have worked a lot with lawyers, amongst them, of course, Nico and Marcus and many people in the room. And so let's crack on. I have 4 parts. I want to talk about definitions and concepts, the research design, and then I demonstrate the application of the design with an illustrative case study, and then I come to my conclusion. Now on the concepts, I mean, I know there are many people in the room who work with norms, and so I thought I might, since there are so many definitions out, I should better start with the way I define norms. I define norms as soft institutions, and I nod to Mark Pollack there. As such, and there I make a bigger step, as such they represent the constitutive institutional subset of global order. And you'll see in a moment that norms, in our discussions in Cambridge, often lawyers would work with the term rule rather than norms. I stuck with norms because that's now also an entire research field in international relations. And so I'll come to the details a little later. Then, of course, norms have a dual quality that's pretty much shared amongst international relations scholars. So they're both socially constructed and structuring, and that makes them so interesting in such a useful reference concept for studying both politics and law. And in order to bring lawyers and political scientists together, I suggested a typology of 3 types of norms. One is the broadest type, that's fundamental norms, like Kelson's Grundnorm, if you wish, or the broadest principle possible. The second are organizing principles, which I call type 2. And these are the most interesting type for people who work on policy and politics and who are actually engaged in hands-on politics. But they are the least well studied in my experience. And then there's the regulatory standards, the type 3 norms that we all know, like emission standards and so on, which have been studied a lot by public policy people, lawyers, and political scientists alike. And so the key point that I want to make here is that the typology allows for a distinction between value-based and fact-based norms and how they work. And we have heard a lot about value recently, and values seems to be something that's understudied, and especially against the background in my own field and social constructivism and international relations. We have had a long, very well-established tradition on studying fact-based norms as social facts. And through my engagement with law, I have learned much more about the values and the contested values and sort of the high contestation of values, which is now at a point where we are wondering whether international law is actually in crisis. And I hope that this framework might get us to a point where we can work on that. And my particular take on norms, it's a practice-based take on norms research, and you can see how far I got with that, since I'm now co-authoring with Christian Büger, who's the main practice theorist, one of the key practice theorists in IR next to Vincent Pouliot and some others. So we joined forces together to bring practice studies and norms a bit more together in order to focus on the crisis of the global liberal order. So research prepositions here are that norms lie in the practice, and I think that's widely shared with lawyers. I mean, certainly I've been working with this assumption for the past 2 decades. And then therefore, and I quote Emanuel Adler here, all practices are normative. Now, the question then, of course, is from a, if we observe what's going on with regard to these practices, whose practices count? And we can do that by mapping empirical research, and people have done it. And so we have a large repertoire of case studies there. But this question, like whose practices ought to count, that's of course a move towards the normative. This raises a question about legitimacy. Who is part of the construction of norms? And just now, like a second before I got onto this talk with you, there was a small sort of engagement on Twitter about how do we make people accept the pandemic conditions. And my answer would, of course, be you need to engage them. You can't just dictate them what to do, but people need to understand and be part of the process of defining norms in order to be willing to follow them. And the pandemic is a very good example for that. Now, my key principle is the quod omnis tangit principle: what affects all must be approved by all. This sustains the point I just made. And then the question is about agency. And this is the agency of the governed. And this agency can go in various ways. For example, here we can, of course, a lot of the compliance literature looks at the sort of at norm following, complying with the norms of governance. And my question is more like how can we actually see or feature or facilitate input of the agency of the governed towards the norms of governance? And that, of course, I take from the public philosophy of Jim Tully. Now, the research objective here is make all affected stakeholders' practices count for normative change in world society. And you will all be scratching your head and say, well, this is impossible. Yes, I say, but then look at what the lawyers say. Accounting for all sources of international law in principle. And so I take this kind of idealist approach on like the attempt to make as many as possible stakeholders' practices count. And of course, and I come to that in a moment, we need to have selection criteria of where to start. That's obvious. So the approach I call international theory, with a nod to Stefano Gozzini and his journal, where we bring together political science, law, and the social sciences. So this is a large interdisciplinary enterprise. And I want to suggest to work with norms as a vehicle for research on global order, which offer a bottom-up perspective. That's at least the way I look at norms. I don't look at a norm because I think it should be implemented. I look at a norm because it tells me something about the state of the legitimacy of international law and global governance. So this is a bit different from the more focused studies on compliance with a given order, where often the given order, like the liberal international order, is bestowed with a particular virtue in and by itself without problematizing that virtue. When you start from the bottom, then of course you look at value, the use and the mobilization of values from the bottom up towards the legitimation of governance norms. Now, I look at 2 types of structures here. And again, I mean, this is, I bring in comparative politics and historical institutionalism. When you look at the left-hand side, I look at opportunity structures. So there's a nod to Dan Killeman and Charles Tilley. And I call these local normative opportunity structures, which set the rules of engagement for the contestants. And here we can then look at norm change, for example, extant, emerging, or hidden norms. And secondly, we can identify whether norms are upgraded or downsized. There was a good example is the debate on torture prohibition, where you have had a lot of discussion about certain states being engaged in downsizing the torture norm. That's also one of my case studies. So then the second structure is what in international relations theory is referred to as the normative structure of meaning and use. And I don't take this to be local, but global, which is a sort of a reflection of globalization and movement and border crossing, where we often, when we travel, we notice that we are stuck, that people don't behave in the way that they're expected to. So this is kind of the cultural dimension of norms. So we're looking at normative meanings, and by identifying changes in this structure, at least that's what I in my book, I could come up with issues and tensions that matter globally. And so that's, of course, I can only provide sort of a hint, but I can say something about the state of the world. And since you see that in the end, a lot of the affected stakeholders in my illustrative cases actually pointed to the contested norm of universal jurisdiction and legality. So these are the calls that you find from stakeholders who operate from the bottom up. Now, of course, both structures are interrelated. And now I'm working towards my research design. And I work with and here you see my eclecticism that comes from my interdisciplinarity. I work with three principles. The first, P1, is contestedness. The second is, P2 is sustainable normativity. And the third one is quod omnis tangit. Now, the contestedness is an observation that in global society, norms are always contested because norms are constituted locally and through practice, and they don't travel well. So in a global frame, we expect contestedness. So that's something that we work with. Now, sustainable normativity is a concept that I have developed with reference to T.H. Marshall's work on citizenship, where he basically comes down at the point of saying, well, we have citizenship right and citizen rights and citizenship identity, but we also need access, to think about access to citizenship. If we have the right and don't have the money for the bus that takes us to the ballot station, not to the United States, then in the current situation, then of course you don't have balanced citizenship rights. Now, so sustainable normativity is something that I elevated towards the global level. In the book, there's an entire chapter of it, and I won't bore you that much with it now. Importantly, sustainable normativity can be observed at the mesoscale of a global order, where the all-important organizing principles are generated through participation in policy and policymaking and politics. And the quod omnis tangit principle is about access to contestation. Now, how do I do this then? How do I transfer this into research? First of all, I take an ethnographic approach that follows the conflict. And here we have two solid indicators. One is contested norm violation, and the other one is contested compliance. And so you see, like with contested norm violation, you will have stakeholders that protest against the breach of fundamental norms. And contested compliance, you see mainly stakeholders that are states and that are interested in contested compliance and enhancing the compliance with the norms of global law. Now, where the second, the sustainable normativity, and this is where my my contestation theory comes in, where my argument is that sustainable normativity exists when we have a balanced practice between both reactive and proactive contestation. Reactive contestation is protest against, proactive contestation is the ability to engage in critical construction and further development of norms. And I refer that to the typology in a moment, and so you see how that works as indicators. And then, of course, and this is where I deviate a little bit, and I took a risk with my book, access to the global multilog. Through evaluation, we find which stakeholders do have access to proactive contestations and which of them don't. And this is where in my book, I took this risk of academic intervention, where I actually staged stakeholders into a global multilog who actually in reality did not talk to each other before. And I was kind of surprised that Cambridge bought that, but I'm of course happy that they did. So here we go. I'm staging those multilogs. Now coming to the contents. How do I operationalize my research? From contestedness, I start with sensitizing reading, take a global bird's eye perspective, and look at these conflicts about contests that are brought to the fore through contestation. The second step looks at the opportunity structure at local sites. I'm zooming in on the local sites where contestation takes place. And the third step is then again the zooming out, where I take those contesters that I have identified through observation and mapping, and where I evaluate a lack of access to dialogue and proactive contestation, and I put them on the global stage to see, once I pitch the arguments of these stakeholders against each other, where does that take us? What does that tell us about the state of global governance? Now, then we have the leading question throughout access to contestation, as I said in the beginning, and I start with when do I have sustainable normativity? As I said before, when reactive and proactive contestation are in balance. And this I find out at local sites, which are subunits of global society. And these subunits can be located at the micro, meso, and macro level. And it's important to locate them with regard to the power of constituting norms. And this is kind of the pre-run. I prepare you for my cycle grid model, where you will then see the sites, 9 sites listed. But let me just say something about challenged normativity. And this is when access to contestation is unbalanced. And here we have various scenarios that are possible. I start with the sort of the most plausible scenario which we have at the moment with regard to international law, with regard it's emerging from the pandemic. We have that with regard to human rights, that reactive contestation is much higher than proactive contestation. And the result is that we also have a growing amount of protest, resistance, and conflict, which is likely to trickle across these local sites. And so that we then come to a situation of a global crisis. Again, with the reference to the work, the really very capable work on international law, we can see that this situation is very much sort of descriptive of what we're seeing at the moment. The other extreme would be, I'm coming to countermeasures, which are of course pathways to participation. And in my illustrative case study, I can show some of these paths. Now, the counter scenario is proactive contestation is high. So proactive is higher than reactive. And in a sense, that leads us to a situation of radical democracy, where we can expect a lagging in decision making, and we can raise this question about compatibility with a global setting. So we need some sort of normative structure where both reactive contestation, objection to what's going on in governance, and proactive contestation is possible. And that's, of course, that is the state of affairs that we would expect in a functioning liberal democracy. Now, here's my cycle grid. First of all, I show the grid. And I have taken these 9 sites. I have actually looked at the well-known research on norms in international relations, where you look at constituting norms, negotiating norms, or implementing them, just to demonstrate the declining access to power in this process of a norm implementation. So obviously the constituting stage is the stage where heads of state and government and courts have the power to constitute norms, treaties, and so on. Now, the levels you see from following top down, macro, meso, micro, are scales of global order. I call this order rather than society or community. And then I overlaid this grid with a cycle. And to come to the cycle, I distinguished, and this is where the normative dimension of this research comes in, distinct practices of validation, which again are differentiated with regard to access by stakeholders. So we have formal validation, which is more common in legal studies. We have social recognition, which we know very well is the key for norms to be followed, because this generates appropriateness. And we have cultural validation. And we don't talk a lot about cultural validation, yet this is where we find where the day-to-day experience, capabilities, knowledge production, and cultural diversity. Now, what does this say about the power of agency? Formal validation leads to the power to be part of the process of constituting a norm. Social recognition is the agency of reacting to a norm because you feel it is normal, it's appropriate. So this is already sort of scaling down into society, into social groups or communities, which are a precondition for social recognition. And then finally, reenacting the normative structure of meaning in use. Well, this has been a category, the cultural validation, that hasn't been considered as particularly powerful, but it can, of course, be turned around once we start taking into account what a diversity of stakeholders has to say with regard to the norms of governance. So I put these 3 practices of norm validation onto a spinning cycle. And this cycle is sort of an overlay of these sites in order to indicate that at each site, at any particular time, the 3 types of validation are possible, but our evaluation will find that only sometimes, for example, if you look at site 1, you have the head of states and government that are the most powerful, that will have access to formal validation, that will, after reiterated meetings, for example, in the UN setting, have access to social validation, will also, by definition, bring in their background experience that enables them to exercise cultural validation. So on side 1, you find the most powerful set of actors. And it gets interesting when you have distinct groups of stakeholders on side 1 contesting a particular norm. reversely on side 9 on the bottom right corner, you see stakeholders that will have the opportunity to say no to the implementation of standards, and they will not have access to formal validation. Their access to social recognition depends on their sort of the social fabric in which they move on everyday basis, but they will always bring cultural validation to the table. And if you see the distance between side 1 and side 9 is, for example, something that helps us to understand current deviations or current unrest with regard to COVID, if you wish. Now let's move on. Very briefly, but this is kind of, let me see, how much time do I have? Okay, I'm fine, right? For like 3 minutes. Just to uncover a little bit like the literature that I'm drawing on here in IR with regard to the practices of norm validation. If you now look at the constitutive validation practice, then you have a reference to the community. You have the reference to text, conventions, agreements, and documents, and basically a function. This is mainly referring to functional contestation, as in legal practices, litigation, and so on. Now, the second bit, the social recognition, is the one that's been most researched by IR constructivism. That's kind of stable social groups, norms, routines, appropriateness, and so on. So the interesting aspect here is conflictive social behavior where agents don't follow a norm, and this is the ouch factor when constructivists get excited and see how you can make norm followers, designated norm followers, comply. Now, this needs to be split, however, the habitual reaction group, because you have social groups amongst international elites that would be sort of the arguing groups, with a nod to Thomas Risse and others, that negotiate within legitimate frameworks in the Habermasian sense. But you also have social groups in domestic contexts that feel norms are appropriate through everyday practice. And now the final one, the cultural validation bit. Here, this is where I, coming from the bottom up, bestow a lot of interest. How do individuals engage in reenacting meaning and use? What kind of contestations can we expect? The clashing of conflicting background experiences, expectations, and interpretations. These matter in particular because the reliance on social groups is, of course, declining with our movement and with globalization. Now, the illustrative case studies in my book, I look at fundamental rights, torture, prohibition, and sexual violence. Today, I just will provide a brief example on the sexual violence aspect, where I used, I compared fundamental norms, taking the norms as prototypes that we all know very well from global constitutionalism, like the rule of law, democracy, human rights, and so on. And then I looked at the fundamental norms that mattered in a particular illustrated cases. And this is the one in the middle, where I come to in a moment. Key here is that with fundamental norms, we don't expect a lot of reactive contestation because they seem okay to most of us. And they are very fuzzy and broadly defined. But we require a high degree of proactive engagement in order to actually make them work. We need to identify ways in which these norms are implemented in different local contexts. And for that, the organizing principles are really important. And with organizing principles, we have a balanced contestation, because organizing principles, like a very good reference, is the common but differentiated responsibility with regard to climate change, where we see how over time this norm, the meaning of this norm has changed. It has been adapted through politics and policy making. I won't go into the details here, but these norms carry the legitimacy of a process. Now, in my case studies, and here I point to the sexual violence prohibition, then I look at the possibilities of organizing principles that emerged through these contestations. For example, the documentation of details matters or security matters. These have become organizing principles in a process which then are implemented through new paths in a particular policy field, providing access to new security sectors. And in this case, the new security sectors are women who operate locally. Now, okay, so I'm almost at the end. Sexual violence prohibition and the culture of impunity in this case were the key fundamental norm. One visible as a prohibition, a legal prohibition. The other invisible, culture of impunity, was a hidden norm. Now, you see a breach of an extant norm and the emergence of a hidden norm with the culture of impunity in this larger process. What is really important, even though it looks minimal here, you see the reproduction of my cycle grid, the grid there, and you see on the right hand side where the arrow points to, you see in all 9 sides of the grid there is stakeholder movement. Each number, like the 1, 1 or 4, 4, stands for stakeholders that are active. So the more movement, the more engagement we have on these sites, the higher the probability that organizing principles will come to the fore through their engagements. And you see the list of stakeholders that are busy here. So what I then come up with in the end are the type 2 norms that are emerging, and we don't need to go into the case in particular, and also the global themes of tension, which in this case was countering the hidden norm of silencing detail, and pathways to participation. Now, in the conclusion, my pre-final slide, so this practice-based perspective on legitimacy then is following the question whose practices ought to count in recognizing the multiplicity of global agents, and it encourages academic intervention, of course, responsible academic intervention in staging global multilogues in order to get voices out. And with this last slide, I end, and this is also where my law paper, I think, starts from in the college group on international law. It's just this triangle on normative change as both value-based and fact-based, on the different types of norms and the practices that are coming in. And I stop there. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Antje, for kind of like tour de force through different aspects of your research. Very, very illuminating, very interesting, and lots of interesting points that come out of that. Now we give the floor to Erna, who can react to that, and after that we'll give Antje a chance to respond and then open the floor. I want to say a few words about how we do this technologically, but first, Erna.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to discuss Antje's paper today, and that's for many reasons. One being that I'm a long-term fan of her work, but the other is that it's always exciting to catch a glimpse of the frontier of norm research, which Antje's work has pushed multiple essential ways in the last decade. And the other is that this is such a rich and multifaceted paper that it advances our knowledge and thinking of norms in so many different ways. And of these, I would like to zoom in on one particular aspect as an international relations scholar, find particularly interesting. And this is actually not only a theoretical conceptual contribution, but also opening up, hand in hand with this contribution, a wonderful empirical research agenda. In terms of theory and conceptual contribution, Antje's paper enters into a dialogue with a very recent work in norm literature, which takes an issue with a well-established stance in constructivist research, and this is to bracket the ethical implications of norms and research them only as social values. So to bring the example of slavery, for instance, it has been an established norm as a social fact for centuries, whereas the ethical implications are deplorable, but the two doesn't necessarily have to go hand in hand. And social constructivism occupied itself by looking at the social fact aspect of norms. And this new emerging literature on norms says, no, we have to engage with normative evaluation of norms. However, the reason why social constructivism and normative theory was apart is because the standard way of doing that was to measure norms based on an abstract principle. And I think what this new literature and Antje's paper is doing is actually to say, no, we shouldn't measure based on abstract principles. We should evaluate norms, the validity and normativity of norms based on pragmatic standards. And to that proposition, Antje's work offers a beautifully simple and yet very encompassing principle, and this is the quod omnes tangit principle. What touches all must be approved by all. And it offers as a normative ethical basis against which we can scrutinize all practices of norm contestation. And that empirically, or in terms of research agenda, translates into a simple question. In every case, every context, every practice of norm contestation, how well is this principle upheld? How is it restricted? What are the conditions of violating or broadening it so that everyone who is impacted by a norm has actually access to contesting, to shaping the norm? And I already mentioned this key concept that Antje also focused on. This question actually translates into the question of access to contestation, which is the central idea. And this access to contestation happens and is researchable, becomes researchable at particular sites, as Antje defines them, depending on where we are in the stage of norm implementation and which scale of global order we are. And each of these sites have their own particular configuration of access to contestation. Now, this wonderful idea produces two things. One is the theory of norm change, which is of particular interest to many of us across IR, international relations, and the PATH project in particular. And this is a theory of norm change, which is actually a theory of normative change as well. Because what it is about is it's about the broader access agents have or participants have to contestation, the more ethically valid the norm becomes. But at the same time, it becomes more firm as a social fact as well, because the more people who are impacted by it uphold the norm, the more they consent to it, the more they can shape its scope, the stronger it will be as a norm, as a social fact. And apart from this theory of normative change, it yields also, it has a very normative aspect. And it yields an ethical principle, and this is the principle, the imperative of broadening access. And what I was really glad to see is that, in fact, I think this is something that has been already present in Antje's previous work, be it European integration, or the global community of courts. And everywhere we find reference to the imperative of broadening access, which now comes together and becomes even more pronounced. Why we need to broaden access? Because we need to achieve a global multi-loc. And why is this important? Because, as Antje shows, every participant to debates have their own individual idiosyncratic background, which is key to social and cultural validation, which is key to enacting meaning in use. So the more of these backgrounds actually come into play, the more fairer the norm becomes. Second, and this refers back to how not only states are impacted by norms, but a wide range of global agents, this also becomes a normative theory in order calling for encompassing these global agents well beyond states and well beyond state behavior. Also, broadening access means overcoming various practices of exclusion, which are focusing on only institutional fora of contestation or shaping norms, or only formal validation in Antje's framework. And finally, broadening access means that we can gain a wider grasp of a norm's implication. So it can generate a feedback loop, because the more people can actually give an account of how they are impacted by the norm, the more knowledge we generate about every norm's impact. So I found this actually a wonderfully encompassing account, which on the one hand gives us a normative theory of norms based on the quod omnes tangit principle. And on the other hand, it gives us actually a template, a rule of thumb to conduct empirical research, identify the sites, map the access to contestation, map these individual configurations of contestation on different levels, and then see how access to contestation can be broadened. Now, as Nico already signaled, I'm in a difficult position not only of taking in all that this can give us as researchers, but also come up with critical remarks. So that's what I'm going to, in the remaining time, going to do. And the first thing it made me really think, or inspired me to think, is, of course, probably that comes up vis-a-vis every normative theory, and this the very existing power relations in reality. So if the normative basis of the theory is that whoever is touched by the norm should be able to shape the norm, should we say that those who are more touched by the norm should have more say? So I'm giving the example, for instance, if there is a nuclear waste facility that is about to be built up, obviously the locals are the most impacted, yet they are the ones who have usually the least say against state authorities or companies, for instance. So how do we deal with that power difference? How do we, and especially because now I see that to a large extent you are staging this multi-logs, you are interested also in kind of intervening in these dynamics. So how do we equate these power relations? And related to that, second question of mine is, how do we actually define access, or how do we define meaningful access to contestation? So is it that the locals are being listened to? Is it that they are listened to and they are heard, for instance, in this nuclear waste debate that I brought as an example? Or that their proposals are accepted? So where do we set the kind of the barrier to say, okay, they actually could participate, they actually had access to shaping norms at different stages? And then I had a big second question, but Antje has partly or fully has already addressed that, is the difference between fundamental norms, organizational principles, and standards. And I wanted to ask her to elaborate a bit on how access structures look at these different levels, because surely they are very different in terms of accessing contestation on fundamental norms and standards. There are different dynamics of exclusion, inclusion, etc., etc. So I think I will stop here and start the discussion, and maybe join later as it goes. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anna. It's great. Antje, do you want to briefly respond before we open it up to the full audience?
Yeah, thank you very much, Erna. Well, what can I say? I just noticed that there are a couple of my students in the audience, so I'm quite happy that you liked it in a sense, because they are reading my book. So here we go. You three questions, basically, as I hear you asking. One is the question about which stakeholders count with regard to one particular matter. And I have in a paper on agency of the governed in third world thematics talked more about legitimate stakeholders. So the question is who's that needs to be identified. That was not a part of this first illustrative study that I undertook with this book. I basically took a very general approach there. I basically looked at, as I said, I followed the conflict. And so those who were already engaged in reactive contestation and protest, I followed to their local sites to see how are they enabled to participate, what are the conditions of access there. So this is the sort of the concept of following the conflict and undertaking sensitizing reading with Blumer. So then you could also actually link this quite nicely to my former teacher, Philippe Schmider at Stanford, who came up with this idea of vouchers for voting in European integration and European politics, so that people who are actually working, say, in higher education would have more votes on that particular topic. The same is for agriculture and so on. So I think there's various ways of also Heidrun Abromite's work on democracy or on Calypso's work would be very helpful, and there we would benefit from the work on democratic participation, which is not an area that I have followed very much. It's also not very prominent in IR. So that I think maybe on the how to establish access, that sometimes it's, you know, and I can always say, oh, you need pathways, but then pathways how, you know, through town hall meetings. A good example is the refugee situation in Germany, like We Can Do This, the 2015 situation, where we could observe that in villages or communities where the inhabitants, the citizens had been asked, like, where to construct housing for the refugees, they were all willing and happy to be part of this, or the majority. But as soon as they have not been asked, and when the places were sort of identified where this housing was to be constructed, you had an opposition right from the start for all sorts of reasons. So that's just one anecdotal example, but that's where we would start to figure that out. And then, of course, on the typology, I think I said something on that in the slides, and I won't bore you with that right now. And I think Nico wanted to come in as well. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Antje. I have all kinds of questions, but I want to hold on them for a little while to give others the floor and kind of open the debate right now. So the way we do this is kind of for all those of you already kind of inhabiting WebEx kind of on a daily basis, right? So you can raise your hand on the right-hand side in the participants panel. When you click on participants, there's a possibility for you to raise your hands. And then hopefully I will see that and I can call upon you. So for those of you who have raised their hands, I would also encourage everybody really to kind of switch on their videos as far as their internet link allows, because it just makes it a bit less abstract, really, kind of everybody's participation. So in a sense, kind of it makes it look more like a normal room. And as we're trying to imitate what normality once was, that might be helpful. All right, yeah. So great. Okay, who would like to go first and raise their hands, ask a question, or challenge Antje in one way or the other? That's always the most difficult moment, really. Oh, well, I see Markus. Markus Gehring. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually Antje who's challenging us as international lawyers to think outside the box, right? So much of international law teaching focuses on immutable norms and rules that can never be changed and can never be turned around. So my question is, at the moment here in Cambridge, we're sort of trying to think how to decolonize the curriculum, right? As many other universities are doing it as well, how to take the diversity really seriously. So here's my question. How would you recommend that norm contestation should be taught in a general public international law course? And would you agree that we all need to sort of get out of the sandbox in which we play and transcend sort of the disciplinary boundaries, maybe injecting a level of IR knowledge into the teaching and the learning about international law? And would you say political scientists would also benefit from that in the other direction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Do you want me to, thank you, Marcus. That's excellent. Do you want me to answer straight away, Nico, or?
Yes, maybe you go ahead. Maybe later we might group, depending on the time we have. But go ahead, I think.
Well, I think these are really excellent and important questions, and I think some input that I actually obtained on decolonizing the agenda of international public law was provided by Sunja Pahuja, of course, when she talked about the decolonial approach to organization law, and I thought the key aspect that sunk in with me, not being a lawyer or an organization lawyer, was the refreshing absence of starting from the concept of the state as the main actor, because she was describing how one after another the agreements and contracts that had been signed pushed the colonializing agenda, so that one after another nations that were intact prior to the contract were losing power and standing with each contract. So in a sense, I would probably start with a contract and follow her path and look at the way how, like, what are the roots? What are the sides where the contract was first contested and negotiated, and who was left out of the contestation? And again, we are with who was left out. So that was the reference to Sunja. Then, of course, the second one that I find really helpful is the practice-based approach that Jutta Brunet and Stephen Toop have been advancing. And I think they are really close with IR practice theory, and they even allow the contestation of legality. And, you know, for that to offer a framework where you have the normative grounds through, like, the Fullerian approach, where you generate legitimacy through practice. And if a lawyer can say this, then I think we can follow them. And so that's one thing. And then, of course, the third is, I think this refers to Nico, your work, because Nico and I have been engaging in heated debates with constitutional lawyers. And whilst I've been framing global constitutionalism, and Nico kept saying, no, there is no such thing as global constitutionalism, and Matthias Krumm was preaching the holy trinity of global constitutionalism, I'm fully, and I have always fully been with Nico to say, no, it's about pluralism. We don't need global constitutionalism as a frame. I would say we need it as an agora, which allows us to talk to each other, which we did, and I learned a lot from it. But the point is that the pluralism and the way that you approach how institutions work, I think, Nico, that I see certainly in your work. And I think it's these three venues that help me a lot when I refer to law, in order to have a bridge between what we're doing in international relations theory and international public law.
Yeah, great. I have Eski and Pedro on the list. Eski. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted now. Thank you, Antje, for this great presentation, and thank you, Erna, for the discussion. And definitely is the highlight of my day, and definitely brought a lot of happy memories about the interdisciplinary studies between international relations and international law. And as you can imagine, my questions will be about that, and mostly about the basic definitions, which Erna's comments kind of touched upon. But I'm wondering even further than the distinction between fundamental norms and organizing principles and vis-a-vis access. So what is the distinction between legal norms and social norms, which include traditions, trends, customs, fads, whatever? And will all these different types of norms go through the same cycle grid? And a second question related to this one, but also to our project, Paths of International Law. We look at, how law changes, and we look at the role of institutions and legal instruments in that regard as well. And in the paper, you talk about, for example, the Kyoto Protocol, the UN Security Council Resolution on the Women, Peace and Security as significant accomplishments. And these are definitely significant instruments in that regard. But what other role do they play in the whole story of contestation, and especially on this norm cycle grid story? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this question always comes up, and I'm glad that you raise it again. What is the distinction between social norms and legal norms? You could, of course, from an observation, when you start, legal norms are part of a treaty. Social norms are part of a social group. Then you're still left out with the cultural norms that people also sometimes refer to. But you can also start from the, if you wish, from the beginning, from the way a norm is constituted. And Fritz Stadthoff always has this wonderful reference to the promise of marriage. What makes somebody says yes in a church, and a few people are standing around them, and the next thing they know is they're married. If you do the same thing on a balcony, and also with a few people around you, then you are not married. You just made a promise somewhere else. So it is the action is the same. You say the same thing, which is a social interaction, but the context that frames it turns it into something that with a different meaning. So what I'm trying to say here is that, and even Armin von Bogdandi has gone that way, to say the law is a social construction. And we decided to follow this particular law and not another law. And I mean, you just need to look at the Canadian situation, or in the First Nations around the world, where laws that one group of society has been holding high for centuries or thousands of years are less valid than the laws that have been imported by a more powerful group, which turns the law, the norm, into especially the legal norm. It only obtains the status of a legal norm through particular power constellations at a particular point in time. So that's why I try, and here I come to the typology, that's why I say, I don't start with the distinction of a legal norm, a cultural norm, a social norm, an evaluative norm, a constitutive, a regulative, but I simply start with a norm, as I said, is a soft institution that matters for institutions of global order. And then the distinction is that the fundamental norm, I work with ideal types. I mean, that's what social scientists do all the time. So a fundamental norm is most widely accepted. So we expect very little contestation, very little sort of objection to it, like wonderful things of human rights. You have, I mean, it's almost like lip service around the world that everybody is trying to comply, at least with lip service, to human rights, democracy, and so on. But that doesn't tell us anything what's happening on the ground. I mean, human rights, despite human rights of the United States, is still killing people in prisons. because that's their legal way of proceeding. And the same is true in other jurisdictions. So what I'm saying here is I'm distinguishing according to moral reach of a norm, and the highest moral reach, the highest sort of reference to a norm as value-based, often that is matched with the claim that a norm is of universal value, lies with fundamental norms. So that's the observation. And the expected degree of contestation makes that distinction. Then I move on to let's just move totally down to the third type of norm. These are kind of legal standards, emission standards, so labor standards, regulations, and so on. Very clearly defined, often part of law, part of treaties, where the moral reach is almost not existent. The norm is almost like a flat pack of furniture. What is in there you can use, and you can decide to not build it or not use it, but you cannot turn like a sofa into a bit of shelf. So here the only answer is yes or no. You can't contest the value of this norm. And that's why the move to the middle that I hoped to open with this little book on contestation theory in 2014, where that's filling the gap where the organizing principles lie, because these organizing principles you have a balance between, like, for example, common but differentiated responsibility. That's a norm that evolved in the negotiations towards Kyoto. It tried to bring people together to say, yes, we share a responsibility to counter climate change, but there is a distinction that needs to be established through further negotiation, depending on a series of other factors. And there you have, this is a pathway. This is a pathway that's generated through a norm, where you have a balance between proactive engagement, i.e. negotiating the way this responsibility plays out, and perhaps reactive engagement, where some people say, well, I don't buy what you're saying. I don't feel responsible at all. But everything is possible at this particular level. And in my reading, the responsibility to protect also fits that slot. The R2P people don't like it that much because they think it should be a fundamental norm, but I see R2P as a container that is facilitative, and that's why it has attracted so much attention by lawyers and political scientists alike. I hope this was helpful. Thank you, Ezgi.
Okay, Pedro.
Hi, thank you, Professor Wiener, for your very, very interesting framework and presentation. My question, so I'm also a part of Professor Krisch's project on change in international law, and a lot of our efforts go into tracking down the trajectory of norm change and understanding what determines that trajectory. And although we haven't come to final conclusions on that, one of the things that somehow becomes clear, at least in my own research, is that not all the voices count the same, and that different actors have different levels of power to shape the trajectory of a norm. Actually, just to mention an example from Ezgi's work, which is very telling, on the rules of continental shelf delimitation, she showed how even if state practice was heading to certain directions, the International Court of Justice, by deciding the case of the North Sea, kind of dissolved a little bit that trajectory and really impacted it. So I want to ask you how does your framework account for different, let's say, power in different voices and different capabilities of shaping the trajectory of a norm? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not saying that the framework will solve the conflict, but I use it as something which helps me looking at a conflict from a particular way. So I see a conflict, and then it helps me. I kind of know, like it's almost like I have a running list where I know step 1 is this one. Okay, I see the conflict. Step 2, I follow the conflict. Step 3, I go to the site where the conflict started, or where people are actually engaging, and then I can see, okay, where are they on my sort of with relation to the access to norm validation, and where are they with access to contestation. And so with all the question, I mean the maritime question, also with the global Arctic, we had these discussions with Klaus Dotzier in Hamburg recently. I mean, there's an enormous field that is opening up for, especially for this kind of research on norms, where it is important to identify who is actually in a legitimate position to hold the power to have the power to actually design something or address, or like the decision of who has access to the Arctic, who is a player in the Arctic. But that's often part of it's not enough to know about the conflict, but you need to understand who is part of the conflict. If you compare, for example, I mean, I know I move a little bit towards the Arctic because I kind of know that topic better, that we're doing research on this in our climate excellence cluster here. And you see how, for example, Greenland has opted against sort of the status of an indigenous country and wanted to be an independent country. So then Greenland will not have access to certain reconciliation norms, where at the same time the Canadians are with their plurality or plural background. I'm simplifying awfully here, but they have access to different norms and a different sort of normative background from which they are making their argument. And then you have the third group where you have sort of the IO, a constellation of states that are sort of coming together on contested territories that are, I think, Marcus is looking at me. You probably know it much better than I do. But what I wanted to say is that you need to understand that the actors come from a different background and they are operating under different rules of engagement, which are part of the normative opportunity structure that you find on the side. And so there, I think there's a lot of work that can be done, and where the grid will probably come in helpful. I mean, we're using it. And so we're using it for comparing, taking an approach to study contested climate justice in sensitive regions. And we compare the Arctic and the Mediterranean, the Wiener region, Western Asia and Northern Africa, where we basically say most of climate litigation you find in the north, you find in northern courts, you have sort of northern principles, concepts, climate change, but maybe climate justice is a completely different thing to somebody in the Mediterranean, compared with somebody in the Arctic, compared with somebody in, sitting in a hearing in Washington, I guess. Yeah, I hope that is helpful towards your answer.
All right, I put myself on the list, and then I see Dorothea has raised her virtual hand. Yeah, thanks, Antje. I have a few points I'd like to push you on. I mean, I'm generally kind of very sympathetic, and I find kind of the normative impulse in your work is tremendously important, right? Especially kind of to uncover and give visibility to contestatory practices that otherwise are left out. I mean, I think that's tremendously important. I'm somewhat wondering, though, kind of how to do that best, and whether somehow bringing the observation of practices and the normative evaluation of them together in the way that you do, whether it really helps us or whether it doesn't somehow muddy the waters and distracts us somehow, and whether that's really kind of a way to think about norm change. And that's particularly so that if we start from a practice account, right, we need to account for the fact that practices are not universal typically, but practices are particular to particular groups and people, right? And so they come up in contingent ways, but so somehow they're different. And obviously, the very shape of the groups that practice something is determined by the group, by the practices themselves, and they are obviously very exclusionary practices. Now we're faced with such exclusionary practices, and you could say that international law, for example, is one of those exclusionary practices where all kinds of sort of lawyers have certain conventions about what counts and who counts and doesn't count, especially, right? If we look at these, so isn't it important simply to call out and say, well, look, that practice, it might be really entirely illegitimate, but that's the practice that changes the norm, right? It is international legal norms sometimes change because the poor people affected by some mining project in Ecuador rise up and challenge the investment agreements that make it possible for multinationals to engage in these mining operations, and then kind of sometimes maybe the treaty changes. Most of the time it doesn't change simply because they're not heard, and Chevron is going to pay them out or is going to do this or that, and kind of whatever you want, right? So the bigger Genco or some other company, and most of the time the norms change not because of this, but they change because the US turns around and has another idea, or kind of some other rich country does and pushes this into one direction or the other. Now, so my sense is that many of the actually norm-changing practices that we see in the world are highly illegitimate. But nevertheless, so we want to have an instrumentarium that makes it possible for us to say, well, look, this is the way things change, and within particular groups of practices, they change. And these are the types of groups and types of actors that are left out of those changes. And this is illegitimate, but in a sense, kind of that operates on in a different sphere and kind of allows us a different take on that, right? So this is the first point I would like to push you on. The second point maybe is the normative point, because you make a strong normative argument in favor of the quod omnes tangit principle. Of course, many people have done that, but people have also said, well, look, it's really under-specified. So Robert Goodin or so kind of have pushed against that for some time. And some Erna's points about the nuclear power station example, I think, sort of pushed in that direction. But there's a general question, I think not so much about who should be included, but how they should be included. Because, of course, in many contexts in which norms are made, we see that actual the difficult stuff of getting to these operational norms, kind of the type 2 norms that you call out, I think they're particularly important indeed. So that is done through compromises and sort of course, all kinds of things that maybe we don't like, log rolling and some trade and so on. But in order to come to agreement among people with very different views of what they want, but also about what is right? Different views about morality. We often need processes through which these can come together and work differences out. So many norms don't arise because we're suddenly all in agreement about what is right, but because we need to work out our differences and come to something common despite our disagreement. And in a sense, kind of having everybody talk might not actually help us in that direction. I think it might help us make visible who might not have been heard before, but to then come to validation practices that might make it possible to overcome our disagreements and differences, we might look into another direction yet. But that's just kind of really provisional thinking.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I'm with you. You see the sort of the contestations of by practices that are illegitimate. We don't look very far. I mean, I just look across the channel and I see the United Kingdom breaking international law. And I mean, we have all kind of, honestly, I mean, you're sitting, it's kind of happening in front of you and you think that can't be, but then it happens. then, of course, my point is, will this trickle across? And that's where the social construction of the law comes in so forcefully, because the more this is going to be repeated, and we have seen it with Poland, with Hungary, and that's why many of us are so unquiet about and really worrying that the European Commission is kind of not moving in a more decisive way vis-a-vis those who are in breach with the European Union Treaty. I mean, we see that. And my point would then be that the political power games, or kind of the strategies that are played behind the scenes, and that's of course, that's what holds European organs back vis-a-vis those who breach the norm. But I would argue that while political sort of strategic consideration made a sort of save the neck of the politician in the moment, they will not pay out in the long run, because in the long run, once a norm is undermined through the bad practice, if you wish, the bad practice of contestation, because it can be good or bad. I'm not saying it's necessarily good, but then it becomes constitutive. You know, it becomes constitutive, and it moves away from the type of order that we have accepted. And if I return to this image of sort of marrying Catholic or sort of Christian marrying, or whoever, I don't care, but sort of operating within an institutional frame, the stronger these illegitimate practices get, the weaker the opportunity structure the institutions get. So this is undermining the institutions. And that's why I'm maybe not as radical as some practice people would like me to be, but I think we need our normative opportunity structures. We need the constitutions, we need the contracts and so on, but we must try to make them work. And that's why at a point, I don't think that just the observing practices of experts that are academics is not enough. I mean, we need to intervene as well. I mean, we've got the knowledge. We know sometimes from our perspective as an observer and an analyst, certain aspects of where a move can be made. So, and I will look into Bob Godin's work, as he said. And of course, I'm not taking the quote on this tangent as something that is solving everything. And I take it as sort of an incentive to think in a radically different way about a global order. Yes, look at all the work that comes out on the contested liberal order. Most people are out to oil the machine, to repair the parts. The order is the virtue in itself. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe the United Nations is not befitting a decolonial global governance agenda. I can't see how Sunjata Pahuja's sort of decolonial organization fits really with the UN. I can't see how the Maori fit with the UN. With when citizenship rights are kind of sold and all the rest of it. I mean, we're moving currently on a slippery slope. That's why the key question that you raised in the beginning, we have this crisis of international law, and we can be happy if it's just normative or norm change, rather than a complete sort of erosion of international law, which could also be the case. Worst case scenario.
Well, yeah, but then again, kind of, as you say, maybe international law as we know it is not befitting the 21st century, or not befitting an order in which lots of actors just don't have a say, right?
Yeah. But exactly, if I may come in, but the important thing is, even as critical as I might be, having lived in Canada for a very long time and looked at sort of First Nations and so on and so forth, and we are aware of things that are going wrong, but I'm not part of I would not sort of topple the United Nations over as if it were an outdated statue. I think that we can actually work with the United Nations and we can make changes, and we just need to see where the changes are happening, where kind of good contestations are happening. That's really the task that I see what in front of us.
All right, Dorothea.
Here we go. Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. I have a way smaller question here. I'm also part of the PATH project, and what you elaborated really resonated with some points I've been thinking about. And I would be really interested in hearing, when you say you start from the conflict and you go to the local site, how do you decide on your tracing path? Because how do you decide that, how do you manage to end up at one specific local site tracing from a global conflict? And do I understand you correctly that basically the one who is loudest is the most important? To what extent is not engaging also contestation? And the example, the most fragrant example from my research I could think of is the relationship between human rights and environmental law. When you start from a conflict of a system that focuses on the protection of environment and a system that focuses on the protection of the human, and then the ruptures that happen between those two systems play out very differently on the regional levels and lead to very different norm change, actually. So there I would start from one conflict, but would end up with very different local sites. Yeah, so that would be my question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I tried, I mean, we didn't talk enough about my illustrative case studies, but the three distinct case studies, the fundamental rights, which looked at the Kadi case, and then the torture prohibition, which looked at the Rumsfeld case, and the Women, Peace and Security, which looked at 1325. And what I found interesting is that with the Kadi case, most of the discussions were happening at the meso or top levels, sort of at the meso or macro level. So you had powerful actors engaging there. And I took the liberty of also engaging some of our colleagues as interested stakeholders, because that's something I learned as an IR person in a conference in Montreal. I remember that many of the international legal scholars wanted to save international law rather than the person who was hoping to win the case. And I thought that was really interesting. And so I thought they are actually affected stakeholders, because their stake is international law. And because I put on a Kadi panel, I put together international public lawyers and European lawyers. And that was in Montreal when we were all in the breakdown after the volcano kind of broke out. And people were then busy trying to find a ticket on the Queen Mary III or something. But that is a footnote. But the interesting aspect is that affected stakeholders, you of course, there's always a potential of cases that is huge. So you need to kind of cut and your repertoire of interventions, of contestations to a certain amount. And what did I do? I think I simply, as I said, I followed the conflict. I started reading the documents, and then I looked at the reactions to the document that I could possibly find. And many of them were actually found somewhere in Italy with some people. I'm not making a special comment. Some were, I was first introduced to this entire Kadi case situation by a group of international lawyers in Amsterdam. And we were sitting in a room, and I had been invited, and they said, oh, well, you work on norms and global constitutionalism, and there's this interesting thing on the Kadi case. And I basically said, I have no idea about the Kadi case, so why should I go there? What do you want of me? And so then with these, I don't know, 30 world-leading international lawyers in the room, I basically, well, I won't explain the entire Kadi case here, but it's about being blacklisted and being put on a blacklist, and then because you are in suspicion of being part of a terrorist organization or whatever. So then I simply and innocently asked these 30 lawyers in the room, as the only political scientist, I said, well, how do you get off that list? And this was in 2008, and basically none of the lawyers had an idea how you got off that list. So through that tiny little contestation, you could already see that there were a few instruments lacking at the United Nations level. They didn't have an ombudsperson, they didn't have control over what's on the list, and so on. So that is one possible path. But there are, of course, many others, and I can't summarize them all here, but I see where you're going.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. I don't see any other hands raised. We're also at our time limit, so we don't need to push that so far. I thought it was really kind of fascinating, and thanks Antje also for the anecdote. Someone can, I think the volcanoes and pandemics and all stuff, they structure our existence. Is what we remember, but also the anecdote of the Cadi case, because of course it also shows how very different sort of communities of practice or epistemic communities have very different anchors somehow. The Cadi case was such an enormously emblematic case for international lawyers who worked themselves up and down on it really for years, as of trying to solve that riddle, which kind of never got solved, but it got somewhat suspended over time in a sort of uneasy balance. But maybe showing really kind of how messy the processes of norm change are, kind of how there are some interventions coming in. Some people, like this rich Saudi businessman, right, Qadi, being able to afford the lawyers to keep that contestation in the European courts going for a decade, right, which sort of hardly anybody else, especially kind of the downtrodden and normally voiceless, right, sort of would have been able to. So that's kind of somehow significant in this whole thing. But of course, there also the possibility of using institutions for contestation that otherwise might not come off the ground because other voices are not heard, and certainly not in the Security Council, right, where somehow you have a particularly exclusive club of that is in charge of changing norms and only listens with a maximum half an ear to what's going on outside the council chamber. So here, I mean, I think kind of the multiplicity and messiness of practices and the practices of exclusion come very nicely to the fore only in this one episode, and there are so many of these. So it was really great. You kind of took us through some of your thinking and the different methodical steps to trying to uncover some of the ways in which international norms are changing. And I think for lawyers, this is it's very helpful also because it helps us to take a step back, as Marcus had said before. I think you're right in saying, well, the international lawyers are affected stakeholders, because often really what the group of international lawyers is acting as is sort of priests of international law, right? As if it was up to international lawyers to save kind of international law, and that makes it, of course, much more difficult really to talk about the problems and omissions really of international law in a meaningful way, right? Because you're always seen as undermining the overall project, right? And as a priest, of course, you're not meant to talk badly about the Pope or God for that matter. So, there's a problem here, and obviously, kind of it helps to take a step back and call out what is problematic and where we see practices of contestation that might otherwise be overheard. All right, so thank you very much, Antje. Thank you also, Anna, for your comments. Thanks to everybody for participating in this panel. We are going to have another paths panel, so trying to get at processes of norm change and law change in the international order. In 4 weeks from now, the 12th of November, we're going to send out details about this in due course. Everybody, please kind of register with the Global Governance Center, who is hosting us here and has kindly provided the logistical support and is generally kind of hosting our project. Register there for the general news about events and that, and you're going to be kept up to date. All right. So,
well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. I really benefited from your questions, and we'll see where this work takes me in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, we're even more curious about that. Yeah, thanks to all. Goodbye for now. Enjoy whatever's left of the day, wherever you are, and see you soon.
Bye-bye. Bye.